and I am delighted to welcome you all to this panel on sexual violence and Christian institutions of higher education. For those of you that may not be familiar with TMTC, we are a graduate teaching and research center of Conrad Grebel University College, affiliated with the Toronto School of Theology and supported by a number of Mennonite academic institutions, including Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, Canadian Mennonite University, and Eastern Mennonite University and Seminary, as well as denominational bodies, including Toronto United Mennonite Church, Mennonite Church Eastern Canada, and Mennonite Church Canada. TMTC is unique in a number of respects. Not least is that it remains one of the few places in the world in which Mennonites have a formal role in doctoral level theological education. And it's the only center that I know of that exists to support students enrolled at other institutions. Events like this one emerge out of TMTC's long-standing vision of being a Mennonite presence at TST and seek to strengthen the relationships between the many institutions and communities that TMTC is supported by and seeks to serve. I am grateful that each of you have joined us for what promises to be a thought-provoking and engaging afternoon. I want to begin by acknowledging the sacred land on which TMTC operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit. As part of Conrad Grebel University College in Waterloo, TMTC is also privileged to operate on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River, that is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. I also want to acknowledge that many others are joining us from across Turtle Island. Now, before I turn proceedings over to our panelists, a word of thanks, as well as a few short remarks about format and expectations. Firstly, I'm grateful for the assistance of my fellow Grebel colleague, Becca Smoot-Entz. All of you will have been in touch with Becca, who is the graduate coordinator for the Theological Studies Department at Grebel and TMTC Administrative Assistant. Becca's with us this afternoon, monitoring various email addresses, Zoom functions, and is available to assist with any technical questions that you may have. Second, you may note that Zoom looks a little bit different from what you may have become used to seeing. We are using the webinar format this afternoon, which means you will only see the panelists and do not need to worry about your own camera or turning your microphone on or off. Please note that we are recording the panel presentations and will make this available on the TMTC website after the event, but we will not be recording the Q&A portion of the panel this afternoon. We will be taking questions after all three of our panelists have presented solely in written form, either through the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, or through the chat function. And we encourage you to formulate and submit questions at any time by using either of these methods. None of the questions will be made public, nor will they be visible to anyone other than the panelists. And if you prefer, there is also an option to ask your question anonymously. In order to facilitate a thoughtful Q&A session, I invite you to consider the following suggestions for respectful dialogue as you listen to the presentations and formulate your questions. Take responsibility for what you say and feel without blaming others. Use empathetic listening. Be sensitive to differences in communication styles. Ponder what you hear and feel before you ask a question. Examine your own assumptions and perceptions. Keep confidentiality and trust ambiguity, because we are not here to debate who is right or wrong. And you'll see in the chat that Becca has dropped those in there so you can review those as you formulate your questions. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to our subject matter for this afternoon and to the panelists who have joined us. When Michael, Carolyn, and Kim initially approached me about this idea, I was immediately intrigued, not least by their provocative title, which to my ear sounded a note of generative eschatological dissonance. A large part of this on my reading is down to punctuation, and particularly the question mark in their title. People of peace, question mark, sexual violence and Christian institutions of higher education. While it may not be overly controversial for wide swaths of Christians of all denominations to agree that we claim to follow a slain and risen Christ, the Prince of Peace, that question mark, coupled with an explicit exploration of sexual violence in Christian institutions, loudly and rightly laments that Christ's peace is not yet with us in its fullness. Sadly, we need not look very far or hard to find instances of sexual violence in Christian institutions. The recent report from the French Catholic bishops that over 200,000 children were sexually abused over 7 decades is only one of the most prominent recent revelations. And painful though it is, we must acknowledge the fact that sexual violence is by no means limited to ostensibly secular institutions or predominantly Catholic ones either, because it can and does routinely happen in our own Protestant and yes, even our Mennonite institutions as well. And perhaps this is where the most provocative and generative part of today's panel comes to the fore, because over the next 90 minutes or so, we will collectively refuse to look away and instead attempt to live into that difficult eschatological calling to be people of God's peace by paying attention to specific instances of sexual violence and excavating potential theological commitments that unwittingly or not may well be at odds with our pursuit of such peace. I'm delighted that we have 3 wonderful guides leading us this afternoon. Michael Buttrey is a doctoral candidate in Christian ethics at Regis College, part of the University of Toronto. His research focuses on moral improvement, virtue ethics, disability, and Thomas Aquinas. Carolyn Mackie is a PhD candidate at the Toronto School of Theology. Her research focuses on the connections between incarnation and philosophical anthropology in the writings of Kierkegaard. Raised Baptist, she joined the Anglican Church of Canada as an adult, and she's been actively involved in advocacy for survivors of sexual violence in Christian institutions. And Dr. Kim Penner works as an adjunct instructor and pastor. She is a previous TMTC fellow, in addition to holding many other roles with us at TMTC. She's taught Christian ethics at Conrad Grebel University College and ethics at Victoria College in the University of Toronto. She specializes in sexual ethics, Mennonite peace theology, ecclesiology, and feminist theological ethics. I'm grateful to each of you for being with us here today. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Kyle. My presentation begins with a case study of abuse involving Eastern Mennonite University, or EMU. I should note up front, I have no connections to or personal knowledge of EMU, and all my information is from either news articles in the Mennonite or from accounts by survivors and their advocates. After a timeline of events, I will discuss hiring, governance, discerning character, and finally, sexual ethics. We begin not with EMU itself, but the story of a woman who reports pastoral misconduct at a Mennonite church in Florida by a pastor named Duane Yoder. The Southeastern Mennonite Conference finds Yoder guilty of sexualizing a pastoral counseling relationship in 2002. The following year, 2003, Lindale Mennonite Church in Virginia hires Yoder as lead pastor. According to the survivor's account, A member of the hiring committee knows of Yoder's behavior, but is, quote, okay with it because he wanted him badly for the Lindale job. Around this time, a man named Luke Hartman is teaching Sunday school at Lindale Mennonite. In a Sunday school class at Lindale, Hartman meets a 15-year-old girl. 4 years later, when she is 19 and Hartman is in his late 30s, they begin a sexual relationship. According to her account, Hartman insists that the young woman keep their relationship secret and delete his emails, texts, and call records. When she starts dating a peer, Hartman responds with verbal abuse, stalking, and threats. In 2011, EMU hires Luke Hartman as their vice president of enrollment. Enrollment, also known as recruitment, is involved with students from high school because EMU teaches undergraduates. According to survivor advocate Barbara Grebel, EMU receives warnings about hiring Hartman from EMU staff and alumni. 3 years later, in August 2014, the young woman who met Hartman in his Sunday school class at Lindale tells her story to a Lindale associate pastor, Don Monger. The next month, Lindale lead pastor Duane Yoder goes with Hartman to meet the president of Eastern Mennonite University. Yoder, Hartman, and the president are in a room. And according to a later report, Yoder and Hartman tell the EMU president about a, quote, consensual affair of approximately 6 months with a 19 to 20-year-old woman from the Lindale congregation. 18 months pass. On January 9th, 2016, the Mennonite reports that Hartman has been charged with solicitation. 2 days later, the Anabaptist Mennonite chapter of SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, issues a public statement. They name possible links between solicitation and sexual abuse and call for potential victims, witnesses, or whistleblowers to come forward. That same day, Hartman resigns from EMU. Later in 2016, the Lindale survivor publishes her story in public on a survivor support website, Our Stories Untold. In May, the Mennonite Church USA panel on sexual abuse prevention recommends an outside investigation by either the Faith Trust Interest Institute, or GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in Christian Environments. In August of 2016, EMU hires a consulting firm, D. Stafford and Associates, to investigate its actions. The next day, the sexual abuse panel announces it will not participate in the firm's investigation and cannot affirm the flawed process that resulted in its selection. And then in September, Mennonite Church USA, or MCUSA for short, also hires D. Stafford and Associates. Finally, in the following months, EMU and MCUSA released reports. These two reports used to be online, but the links on both the EMU and MCUSA websites are broken. Still, according to the Mennonite, the reports exonerate MCUSA and EMU leadership, blaming primarily Lindale pastor Duane Yoder for lying and withholding information. A year later, the Virginia Mennonite Conference terminates Yoder's ministerial credentials. There are several ways we could interrogate the story. For example, we could ask why Yoder's own misconduct finding was ignored, and he only got in trouble for the abuses of Luke Hartman, an African-American man. Or we could ask how the various institutions got away with rejecting the recommendations of the Mennonite Church Canada USA Sexual Abuse Panel. Or we could extend our case study to how EMU has failed other survivors of sexual violence in their campus community before and after these dates. But for this presentation, my focus is on the dynamics of hiring and governance and how we discern character and understand sexual ethics. I'm attracted to these questions in part because I studied Thomas Aquinas, and although for sake of time, I won't quote him, I should note I'm drawing in part on Aquinas' insights into the role of affections and desires in ethics. I'll start with hiring, which is often where we see disordered affections. In Willie James Jennings' book, After Whiteness, He tells the story of watching a hiring committee fall in love with their preferred candidate. He writes that they looked at him longingly and lovingly, admiring his poise, his confidence, seeing in him what they longed to be. Nor was Jennings exempt from this affection. He continues, I loved how he could gather the love of my colleagues through his performance, and I wanted to gather that same love in a performance like his. However, as Jennings now realizes, his love was distorted. Quote, I had learned to love white masculinist self-sufficiency, a way of being in the world that aspires to exhibit possession, mastery, and control. Jennings' word, love, reminds me of the claim that someone on Yoder's hiring committee wanted him badly. Why were Yoder and Hartman so attractive? The survivors' accounts give us some clues. Reading their accounts, my impression of both men is that they were aggressive, bold, charming, confident, persuasive, and above all, smart. Both could be capable of vulnerability at strategic times. I would also say both men had remarkable self-mastery. By that, I don't mean the actual virtue of self-control, but rather the ability to present a preferred persona by carefully curating your words and actions. If my impressions are at all correct, I'm not surprised both men were hired. These traits are exactly what many church and university hiring committees are looking for. Now, by saying this, I'm not excusing anyone who heard any warnings about Yoder and Hartman and hired them anyway. They were culpable. But what interests me is how even innocent hiring committees let themselves be led astray. The error, I think, is not attraction or affection or love itself. Rather, I agree with Jennings that the error is a distorted love that idolizes a false ideal of the self-sufficient man or woman, but usually man. It's easy to heed warnings, not hire a pastor or president with the wrong personality. It's much harder when they present as the kind of person you want to be or have on your team, and you love them for that. And this temptation is especially strong in academia, because as Jennings puts it, aspiration is a key engine in intellectual formation. Now, although I haven't polled every Mennonite, my suspicion is that many would say they are not attracted to the ideal of self-sufficiency Jennings describes. A key Mennonite ideal is peace, and so many Mennonites have tried to articulate what it means to be peaceful, especially for men. Sometimes the result is another list of personality traits: calm, cooperative, easygoing, friendly, a team player, and above all, nice. This list sounds to me like the ideal authority figure. Is putting people with these traits in governance more likely to stop abuse from happening? No. Those who are nice can easily be conflict-averse people pleasers, a trait which can also lead to corruption. A classic lecture by C.S. Lewis explores this subject. In The Inner Ring, Lewis describes how every group has a circle of people who know what's up, who really see what's going on and what needs to be done. This inner circle may overlap with the formal hierarchy of organization, or it may not. But either way, the desire to be inside the circle, to be on good terms with all the influential, sensible, right-thinking people, this desire is one of the primary drivers of human action. Lewis argues the desire to be part of the inner ring is corrupting for two reasons. One, because the enjoyment of being inside is based on exclusivity. Anyone who makes it in must keep it difficult for others to join. Two, because once you are in, you cannot risk rejection. You cannot bear seeing the faces of your new fellows turn cold and contemptuous. Thus, when something not quite right is proposed, or a decision is rushed, or the rules are bent, you go along, because that's the way we always do things. Or, hypothetically, perhaps an irregularity already happened, but we're dealing with it. We have a consulting firm in mind, and they're very good. You don't need to dig into who knew what when, or why survivors and their advocates want a different firm. They're just being malicious, making new complaints to try and embarrass us further. We in this room know what's best for the institution. That's why we're in charge. Now, in stories such as Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, corruption happens to those who display rank ambition. But those who are not obviously ambitious and just want to get along are also susceptible to corruption. Certainly that's been my experience. The few times when I have been in a governance context, I have let my desire to please and impress others make me easy to manipulate. I didn't approve any obvious crimes or abuses, but it's never obvious at the start. Fortunately, my time in leadership was short-lived. Keeping your moral compass straight over the long term, as you learn to play nice with fellow leaders and are indoctrinated in their institutional culture, that's hard. But you may ask, if both brashness and niceness are problematic, what personality traits should we look for or try to cultivate? My answer, personally, is none. What's needed is character, not personality. As a virtue ethicist, I view both character and personality traits as patterns of behavior, but with major differences. Character traits are virtues or vices, habitual skills that reliably translate our desires and thoughts into good or bad action. Personality traits, on the other hand, are not inherently good or bad. In every life, there are times for boldness and times for calmness. Some of us just tend towards more one than the other. However, the same flexibility means that we can curate an inauthentic persona, or if we're skilled actors, a performance that's entirely fake. This is an old problem. The New Testament contains over a dozen combinations of hypocrites, an adaptation of a Greek word for a theater actor. For example, in Matthew 23, Jesus calls the Pharisees hypocrites and says that they are like whitewashed tombs, attractive and righteous on the outside, full of death and wickedness on the inside. Now, when we read Jesus' criticisms, we're not surprised because we know the Pharisees are hypocrites. And similarly, when we read stories about historical sexual abuse scandals, we know who the perpetrators are, and so we're skeptical of them from the outset. But many of Jesus's first hearers would have been surprised by his comments about Pharisees because they believed the Pharisees' self-presentation. So too with revelations of abuse today. Many struggle to believe allegations because we consider ourselves to be good judges of character. And if we've been conned, well, what would that say about us? We're suckers? Inconceivable. Unfortunately, entire communities can be deceived into defending abuse because abusers groom not only their victims, but everyone around them. In Wade Mullen's book, Something's Not Right, he puts it this way, quote, "Ingratiating tactics appear on the surface to be positive displays of kindness, generosity, and friendship, and especially in cultures that place a high value on maintaining tact, avoiding disruptions, and believing the best about others. Abusers can use these subtle tactics to repeatedly cross boundaries without consequences." End quote. Mullen identifies the desire for peace and agreement as a tool abusers can use. This is a challenge for all Christian churches and institutions, but especially Mennonites who see peace as part of their core identity. So, how do we accurately judge someone's character? Imagine you're on a board or a leadership team governing an organization. Everyone who works there has strong incentives to impress you, which means you cannot judge their character based on how they act when you're around. How do you detect problems? One essential step is to choose to listen to those who are the weakest or the least of the community. For example, if a pastor, professor, or administrator has the complete approval of their supervisors and colleagues, and the only criticisms of them come from poor students or employees at the bottom of the org chart, look into it. Or if those with complaints are lower status because of their age, gender, ethnicity, disability, or sexuality, look into it. Or if concerns are expressed meekly, tentatively, or after some time has passed, look into it. Discerning character and preventing abuse is harder than we think. But one good step is to listen to those who have less power, because that's who abusers target, the least powerful among us. Speaking of power, for my last section, I'll briefly analyze the failures of our sexual ethics in abuse cases. Again, according to newspaper quotes, Yoder and Hartman told the EMU president about a consensual affair with a 19-year-old woman, which the president accepted. The Mennonite goes on to say, the consulting firm found reports of another extramarital affair, which the report said would have been grounds for dismissal had EMU administrators been aware of it. This is interesting. Apparently one affair was fine, but two have been too many. Still, focusing on consent, the legal age of consent in Virginia is 18. Therefore, if there is no force, threats, intimidation, or diminished capacity, it is technically legal for a consenting 19-year-old to have sex with someone over twice their age. Of course, as Mennonites should know, the law is not a complete moral guide. But this minimal standard is reinforced by our liberal moral framework. Since the Enlightenment, liberal political philosophy has assumed that human dignity is centered on autonomy, the equal authority of all adults to decide how they will live. From this perspective, all that matters is consent and the capacity for it. And we should not question the validity of a sexual relationship between two capable, consenting adults. Does Christian sexual ethics provide more insights than liberal political philosophy? Well, as an unscientific survey, I flipped through about a dozen popular introductions to Christian ethics or sexual ethics. Common topics were marriage, premarital sex, adultery, divorce, birth control, abortion, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, singleness, chastity, and lust. Sexual assault and power were mentioned only a few times. Abuse and grooming didn't come up at all. Thus, if you were relying on mainstream Christian ethics, you could raise concerns about adultery, but not abuse. Now, there's an argument that sexual abuse is more a form of violence than sex. Can we find discussions of abuse in the violence section of these books? Not in the introductions I examined. And as Lydia Neufeld-Harder, Carol Penner, and others have documented, Mennonite peace theology has also traditionally been silent on violence against women. In fact, the only theologians I've seen address these topics at all are feminist scholars, including TMTC colleagues, and those who write specifically on abuse by clergy. Other than that, it's as if abuse doesn't exist. And of course it can't. Acknowledging that abuse regularly happens within Christian churches and universities would challenge some of our core beliefs about our distinctiveness from the world. What's the solution? Well, it's a hard problem, but a good first step would simply be to discuss power, abuses of power, corruption, grooming, and sexual abuse in books, courses, and sermon series that touch on these topics. This is a separate step from training workshops on sexual harassment and violence, which are good, but typically focus on legal compliance. One mandatory workshop per year is insufficient to transform the moral language of an institution. We need to build discussions of power into our conversations about ethics, sex, and violence. And a good second step is to interrogate Mennonite egalitarianism. By that, I don't mean excluding women from being pastors or giving leaders fancy clothes and titles. Rather, I'm suggesting we need to examine the ideal of a community of equals carefully. Are Mennonites equal before God? Yes. Are Mennonites equal before each other? No. A 38-year-old man who was a university vice president and Sunday school teacher has power over a 19-year-old girl. Pretending otherwise is an invitation to self-deception. I will conclude with a quote from Lauren, the Lindale survivor. She writes, "Predators, abusers, they swing hard against their victims. Once I'm brave enough to embrace another church again, I expect and deserve leadership that swings back even harder. Secrecy, silence, passivity, those protect the perpetrator, not the victim." As Lauren argues, power can be used for good. So let's use our power to protect the vulnerable, not the predators. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to go next. So I am going to share a case study from Nashotah House. Nashotah House is an Episcopal seminary located in Nashotah, Wisconsin. It was founded in 1842, and it is rooted in the Anglo-Catholic tradition associated with the Oxford movement. Nashotah House is known for being theologically and liturgically conservative. Now, I chose Nashotah House for this study simply by searching online for Episcopal seminary sexual misconduct, and the first hit took me to a news article from 1994 describing the case that we will be looking at together. Now, I won't be sharing any graphic details, but I do want to give a content warning that it does involve the sexual abuse of minors by clergy. Most of the actual content of the story will be in the first few minutes of my presentation, if you would like to step away for a few minutes. My research for this study is based on publicly accessible documents, primarily archived newspaper articles. So in 1994, the stepson of a former Nashotah House seminarian came forward to the school with allegations against 5 men, 4 former seminarians, and a priest who had visited the campus for a conference. The survivor was 20 years old when he came forward, and the incidents of abuse dated back to the late 1980s when he was approximately 14 years old. One of the men, Eugene Mackie, was ultimately charged with the sexual abuse of 5 minors, dating to 1987 and 1988. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison and 14 years of probation. And at least some of the other minors he abused were also children of Nashotah House seminarians. 2 of the 5 men were acquitted, and the survivor who came forward also filed a civil lawsuit against Nashotah House, as well as the Episcopal Diocese of Milwaukee and its bishop, seeking damages for trauma. However, the entire suit was dismissed in 1996 as the statute of limitations had passed in January 1994. Now, the school's response at the time of the abuse itself in the 1980s, parents complained to Jack Knight, dean of Nashotah House at that time, about Eugene Mackie's interactions with their children. And at least one of these complaints from a female seminarian concerned about her 12-year-old son came in early 1986, prior to the abuse for which Mackie was convicted. Seminarians living in the seminary dormitory were also aware that minors visited Mackie. It is unclear to me from my research whether they stated this at the time that complaints were first made or only in the 1990s when the case was under investigation by the police. Jack Knight stated later that he spoke once with Mackie to let him know certain suspicions had been raised. He said, "I told him that he needed to behave differently or get help if he needed help." And he did not notify other church officials or the police because he regarded the allegations as innuendo and hearsay. Former seminarians later stated that sexual impropriety was rife at the seminary at the time of Mackie's abuse, including faculty-student liaisons. And after leaving Nashotah House and going into parish ministry, Jack Knight was himself suspended from the priesthood in 1994 for sexual misconduct and unethical behavior, which I believe was unrelated to any of this case. So the school's response at the time that the victim came forward in the 1990s. So in 1992, Jack Knight is replaced by Gary Chris as Dean of Nashotah House. In 1994, the survivor comes forward with allegations. In 1994 to 1997, you have court cases. 3 of the men are sentenced and 2 acquitted. And from 1994, this is a statement, I believe it's from an official statement from the school. The primary goal of Nashotah House in responding to these allegations is to assist the victims of sexual abuse and their families in the process of healing. The dean and trustees also wish to ensure that perpetrators of sexual abuse will be identified so their abusive behavior can be stopped and so they can receive treatment. Now, this kind of statement is often given by an institution after a scandal of some kind has come out. And I include it here because it seems to have been part of an official statement from the school. The main thing to note is that it is entirely aspirational. It states the school's wishes, but gives no indication of what they will do to make any of this happen. And the following quotes are all from Gary Chris, Dean at Nashotah House in the 90s, from an interview in 1995. As far as I can tell, the people here never knew what was going on. You have to remember that in a parish, such cases can have massive effects because even if it is years later, parishioners start wondering about whether their own children were abused. But here, there's been a complete turnover in the students and almost a complete turnover in the faculty. This is a completely different place. It doesn't seem to have hurt us. People have seen that we handled the abuse case openly and we've come through it pretty well. We were right out front about it. We went to the DA, we cooperated fully with the investigation, and we didn't try and stonewall it or hide anything. We met it head on. In her work analyzing institutional responses to sexual violence, Hilary Jerome Scarcella identifies several typical stances that institutions might adopt. One of these is the powerless bystander. The individual or institution adopting this stance, quote, defends their silence, inaction, and wider ethical failures by emphasizing the limits of their knowledge, responsibility, and power, end quote. And in Nashotah House's response, we can see the institution appealing to each of these limits. First, we see the school's appeal to the limits of their knowledge in Gary Chris's statement, as far as I can tell, the people here never knew what was going on. Now, we know from police records that this claim is entirely false. Concerned parents had made complaints to the previous dean, Jack Knight, as early as 1986, and other seminarians living in the dormitory were also suspicious. Instead of taking responsibility for the school's inaction, which enabled the abuse of multiple children on campus, Gary Chris here claims ignorance on behalf of his predecessors. Yet his statement carries the claim of ignorance even further. The phrase, as far as I can tell, implies that determining the truth of the situation is impossible, so that we must rely on his conjectures. His statement demonstrates that the seminary has not undertaken a proper investigation into the situation, either at the time of the complaints in the 1980s or in his own administration when the survivor came forward. Instead, the dean is choosing to maintain ignorance rather than gather accurate details of what unfolded. So some further examples of when this kind of thing might happen. Statements by administrators about their own personal lack of knowledge of incidents are often used to subtly undermine the credibility of survivors. I know nothing about this can be used to cast doubt on whether the truth can even be known, whether an investigation is possible or necessary, or whether the survivor's statements are credible and should be believed. Another example of this kind of thing is, no one has come forward as per our policy. Using an unwritten code of see no evil, hear no evil, institutions sometimes use policies and procedures as a way to protect themselves from official knowledge of abuse. If you don't know something, you can't be expected to respond to it. Deliberately maintaining ignorance is a powerful means of claiming powerlessness. So moving on to limits of responsibility, Gary Chris appeals to the limit of responsibility in this statement. There's been a complete turnover in the students and almost a complete turnover in the faculty. This is a completely different place. By pointing out that he and other members of leadership were not at the institution at the time of abuse, Chris attempts to distance the institution itself from these crimes. He further appeals to the turnover in students to claim that the impact of these past events on the entire community is negligible. Now, it is true that Chris was not dean of the school at the time the abuses happened, and he therefore carries no personal guilt for these abuses. However, Chris's statement wrongfully extends his own non-implication in the crimes to the institution as a whole. Instead of interrogating how the institution might have enabled the abuse of children in their community, Chris emphasizes that the current administration's hands are clean because they weren't there when it happened. He thus shields himself, the institution, and even his not so innocent predecessors from accountability. This is a tactic commonly used by institutions to evade both legal and moral responsibility. Scarsella writes, "The powerless bystander attempts to avoid critique by misconstruing the relationship between the personal and the systemic." And we saw this already in the ways that individual administrators might take their own personal lack of knowledge of an incident and apply it to the institution as a whole. And we see it again here as the personal innocence of particular individuals is used to shield the institution as a whole. And it can happen reverse as well, with all blame being placed on an obviously guilty individual offender in order to evade taking responsibility as an institution. By shifting blame from the individual to the institution or from the institution back to a particular individual, the powerless bystander consistently locates both blame and responsibility elsewhere. Invariably, both the institution as a whole and individuals belonging to the institution carry a share of the blame. It is never just one or the other, and both need to be acknowledged and addressed. Our third quote from Gary Chris points to limits of power. "It doesn't seem to have hurt us. People have seen that we handled the abuse case openly, and we've come through it pretty well. We were right out front about it. We went to the DA, we cooperated fully with the investigation, and we didn't try and stonewall it or hide anything. We met it head on." Now, it may not have been quite that simple. Other reports state that when the first survivor came forward to Nashotah House, Chris forwarded the allegations to the chair of the Board of Trustees, a local bishop with a background in law, and together they called a meeting of the school's executive committee before taking the allegations to the authorities. However, it does seem that the school turned the case over to the DA quite quickly. Now, handing this case over to the civil authorities was absolutely the right step for Nashotah House to take in this case because it involved the abuse of minors. This is the step that the former dean, Jack Knight, should have taken in 1986 when concerns were first raised to him by parents. And cooperating fully with authorities in investigations was absolutely the right thing to do. However, I would suggest that not stonewalling an investigation, not trying to hide anything, is not necessarily the same as meeting abuse head on. It is the bare minimum, not the outer limit of what an institution can and should do to address sexual violence. For some institutions, it can be a temptation to see their power to address sexual violence as bounded precisely by the point at which civil authorities are involved. The powerless bystander will always opt for silence if possible, and it can be all too easy to use the involvement of civil authorities as an excuse for stepping back entirely, washing one's hands of the whole affair. For Anglican institutions, deferring to civil authorities as the locus of power may be a particularly appealing self-deception. Cooperation with civil authorities comes very naturally to Anglicans. Created to provide an ecclesial stamp of approval on a king's divorce and exported as a state church throughout the British Empire, Anglicanism has traditionally enjoyed a privileged relationship with the state. In the Anglican Church of Canada, we know the devastating effects of our cooperation with the authorities in running residential schools, our full and uncompromising cooperation with the federal government in abusing children. In my Nashotah House case study, the two men who were acquitted by jury are both currently serving as priests of Episcopal parishes in California. A witness at the trial for one of these men testified that the defendant had served alcohol to minors on Nashotah House campus. So at the very least, we have a priest who was serving alcohol to minors at a place where minors were being regularly abused. With only about 1 in 10 cases of sexual assault that are reported to police resulting in conviction, Christians need to consider whether our pursuit of justice might call us to something more than solely relying on flawed criminal justice systems. The power to convict someone of a crime may not be within an institution's power, but seminaries and ecclesial bodies do have both the power and the responsibility to do their own due diligence and consider whether someone is fit to be in a position of spiritual authority over vulnerable people. We saw earlier that institutions often deliberately remain ignorant in order to maintain the stance of the powerless bystander. Similarly, institutions will vigilantly guard limits of power in order to maintain powerlessness. There are many different ways that institutions tell survivors, sorry, we can't help you. And some of these are insisting that survivors who didn't follow due process in reporting cannot access care, even if those processes were inaccessible, unintelligible, or unreasonable for persons who have experienced trauma. Insisting that the institution can only address a case if the survivor has first gone to the police. Actively discouraging survivors from coming forward through policies that are publicly unavailable, inaccessible, unclear, or outdated. Maintaining statutes of limitation on historic incidents. Having policies that only support certain people. For example, many churches only support adult survivors of abuse if they were under the pastoral care of the perpetrator at the time of the abuse. Misrepresenting the financial assets of the institution to keep from paying damages. A vivid example of this is the Catholic Church in Canada, which claimed that they were unable to pay the full amount to survivors of residential schools, and this has recently come under scrutiny and is simply untrue. And finally, lawyering up, treating survivors as first and foremost a legal liability, rather than as humans to be treated with dignity and care. So in conclusion, I just want to talk briefly about why does any of this matter? Why does the institutional response matter? The entirety of an institution's response, statements and silence, and actions and inaction, official and unofficial stance, all becomes part of how the abuse is understood by the community. This response signals to community members how they can expect the institution to act in the future, and what or who the institution truly values. Other survivors watch to see if it will be safe for them to come forward with their experiences, while perpetrators watch to see if it will be safe for them to continue their activities unchecked and find new victims within the community. Judith Herman argues that the support of the community is the primary form of justice that survivors of sexual violence seek. And when a survivor comes forward, the community looks to the institution for cues as to how to respond. In this way, institutions have a great deal of power to enact justice. When institutions respond instead with silence or apathy, survivors experience what Carly Parnitsky-Smith and Jennifer J. Freyd dub institutional betrayal. This betrayal can be experienced either in events leading up to this sexual assault or in those following it. Not surprisingly, but significantly, Smith and Freyd's study confirmed their hypothesis that institutional betrayal further traumatizes survivors. Now, Christian institutions of higher education are often initially experienced as safe or even sacred spaces. When these spaces are violated by the institution itself, trauma is compounded and the survivor experiences yet another devastating loss. And when this happens, whether acknowledged or not, harm is done to the entire community. St. Paul tells us that if one member of the body of Christ suffers, all suffer together. When one member suffers, the whole body suffers, whether or not that suffering is felt or acknowledged by others. Institutions may choose to maintain ignorance and refuse to acknowledge the responsibility and power that they have, but this doesn't remove the hurt from the community. Instead, it allows it to be perpetuated. Whether acknowledged or not, abuse and institutional responses to abuse become part of the life of the institution as it moves forward. And community members who follow will inherit this complex legacy of abuse and responses, and the resulting institutional strategies of either avoidance or acknowledgement, self-justification or repentance. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Take a stretch if you need one. Each of these could have been its own event, but here we go. I will be taking a cursory look at the survivor-centered nature of Conrad Grebel University College's response to the John D. Rempel case of clergy sexual misconduct, and using that as a jumping off point for further reflection on institutional ethics. On October 20th, 2020, Mennonite Church Eastern Canada announced the termination of the ministerial credentials of John D. Rempel, following an investigation into multiple complaints of ministerial sexual misconduct, while Rempel served as chaplain, residence director, and adjunct professor at Conrad Grebel University College between 1973 and 1989. That same day, Marcus Shantz, president of Conrad Grebel College, released a statement that described how the allegations of abuse were brought forward. Shantz writes, "Earlier this year, I received disclosures from Grebel alumni of sexual misconduct by Mr. Rempel. At the time, they were undergraduate resident students at the college. With the consent and support of the alumni involved, I made a formal report to MCEC asking for an investigation. MCEC has jurisdiction over the conduct of its ministers, and I'm most grateful for their thorough work and diligence in addressing this situation." Following the timeline of what happened next, MCEC writes in its announcement that it, quote, appointed an independent investigation team to investigate the complaints, according to the Ministerial Sexual Misconduct Policy and Procedure, a denominational protocol. MCEC's Leadership Council received the investigation report. Based on the evidence from the investigation, Rempel's own acknowledgement of certain incidents of misconduct, and a hearing process, Leadership Council found Rempel guilty of ministerial sexual misconduct and ministerial misconduct. Leadership Council considered the range of disciplinary options, and due to the serious nature of the findings, terminated Rempel's ministerial credential. End quote. As I mentioned, my focus today is on the survivor-centered nature of primarily Grebel's responses, but I'll mention a few of MCEC's as well. Here are some examples in which, from their statements that mention support for survivors. From MCEC, "We are indebted to the courage of those who have come forward to share their stories. We thank you for showing us what it means to be brave and vulnerable, and we're sorry that you experienced this harm. If you are a victim survivor of any misconduct of a credentialed leader, we want to hear your story. If you would prefer to reach out to someone who is at arm's length from MCEC, we have arranged for 2 victim advocates who are also willing to receive your story." From President Shantz at Grebel, "Words are inadequate, but on behalf of the college and our board of governors, I want to express our heartbreak, our sadness, and our great regret that they were harmed. I have privately expressed this to each of these alumni, and I am now able to share openly that we are profoundly sorry for what they experienced. Carrying these wounds for decades has been an unfair burden for these alumni, and I hope that bringing this to light brings some healing for them and their families. These Grebel alumni deserve our ongoing concern, support, and prayers. MCEC and Grebel also name their commitment to learn more about how to prevent such abuses from happening in the future. For example, Grebel indicates an ongoing commitment to policies, practices, and training programs that promote accountability, transparency, safety, and respect for healthy boundaries when working with students. They also name a third-party counseling service appointed to receive confidential disclosures from college alumni and former employees related to historic incidents of sexual misconduct and violence at Grebel. Compared to Michael and Carolyn's case studies, which revealed how institutional norms can intersect with theological stances to hinder or harm survivors of sexual violence, I want to look briefly at how Grebel's norms of peace and justice might be at work here to support survivors of, in this case, clergy sexual misconduct. Then, in an effort to determine where to from here, I take a step back to look at how institutions function as moral agents, after which I'll share findings from a study out of Duke University that names 5 factors that impact the frequency of institutional ethical crises, as well as their responses. Finally, I consider the value of doing more to theorize and practice institutional ethics with a commitment to peace and justice clearly defined. As you will see, and as Michael and Carolyn have already noted, the issue of power and if or how it is understood and allowed to operate is relevant to any and each of these conversations. Grebel's norms of peace and justice. A section marked Identity on the Grebel website reads, Conrad Grebel University College is a liberal arts college founded by the Mennonite Church and affiliated with the University of Waterloo. The mission and programs of Grebel are rooted in and inspired by its Christian identity and its Anabaptist Mennonite heritage. Its mission and values follow. Its mission statement: the mission of Conrad Grebel University College is to seek wisdom, nurture faith, and pursue justice and peace in service to church and society. Active peacemaking is listed as one of its core values. Now, Grebel doesn't define its norms of peace and justice. However, insofar as it chooses to name the harm done to survivors of abuse and to be accountable to survivors and their well-being, it, I do believe, reflects a particular commitment to peace, which I would define as seeking the dignity, well-being, and safety of all against abuses of power. It also reflected a commitment to justice as rightly ordered relations of mutuality, insofar as it names policies, practices, and training programs to promote accountability, transparency, and healthy boundaries. Clergy sexual misconduct may not include sexual violence as physical force, but it certainly thwarts peace understood as well-being and as that which violates the victim's ability to consent. And therefore, any efforts to prevent further clergy sexual misconduct could be interpreted as a form of active peacemaking. Theoethically, this kind of reasoning resonates with a discipleship ethic informed by Jesus's words, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and one that is nuanced by some understanding of how unequal relations of power can be used to harm others, including the detrimental impacts of sexual abuse on survivors. For more on that, I encourage you to read Carol Penner's article, Sexual Assault, Resurrection, and the Healing Community. Now, shifting to institution as moral agent. A conversation about institutional norms and theology presupposes an understanding of the institution as moral agent. When the institution recognizes a general commitment to ethics, it must be held accountable to those ethics. Yes, institutions like universities are in all respects run by individuals, but that doesn't necessarily mean that corporate action is simply individual action or the sum of the actions of its individuals. For example, institutions like the church have been held to blame as institutions for institutional policies, even if those policies and acts were performed and formed by individuals. For example, think of residential schools. An interesting research study on institutional cultures and ethical crises out of Duke University illustrates that there are several factors that help shape both the frequency of institutional ethical crises and the types of institutional responses to those crises. We have been talking specifically about institutional norms and theological traditions. And now I'd like to add these additional findings from Duke to the mix. The study was interdisciplinary, and it looked at institutional ethical crises at universities, businesses, and within the military. And it found that these 5 factors played a role. Number 1, institutional accountability, and whether it was tightly coupled, as in a military chain of command, or loosely coupled, as in a university with multiple different stakeholders. Number 2, organizational structure. Is the organization structured hierarchically or horizontally? Number 3, social contract. That is the extent to which the organization has a relationship with its stakeholders, whether that is strong or weak. Identity, as in the sense of belonging that members have within an organization. Is that strong or weak? And 5th, mission. Is the organization's mission explicit or implicit? All of these things could impact, and at sometimes positively or negatively, the institution's response and the frequency of ethical crises. For the purpose of our case, I'll apply the explanatory value here. In general, the findings are that universities have a loosely coupled accountability regime and informal social contract, which may make it difficult for universities to respond to ethical crises since there is less clarity about who its stakeholders are and what that contract is. While a university may have a clear code of ethics or norms that can be an effective tool for preventing and responding to ethical crises, it can also be a barrier for change. Of course, it depends on what that code is, what those norms are, how they are defined, and whether they're embodied. Grebel's strong institutional identity and mission may have informed its survivor-centered response. That said, Eastern Mennonite University, from Michael's case study, also valued peace and justice in its mission statement, but didn't act in those ways. Moral principles can be manipulated, used, and defined to support various political interests and frameworks. Hence, the need for critical awareness of how power exists and functions in relationship, as well as a commitment to healthy relationships of shared power and mutuality. The importance of theorizing institutional ethics. So this brings me to my last point. In the comments section of the Canadian Mennonite Magazine article, about the removal of Rempel's credentials. There is a comment titled "Ethics in Our Mennonite Institutions," and it's written by Cameron Alteres. The last paragraph of her comment submission reads, "Mennonites have been reticent to articulate an ethic of the institution, which would compel us to articulate specifics regarding how to address ethical issues that arise within the institution. Hospitals have medical ethics committees. We talk and write about interpersonal ethics. However, it behooves us to do some serious thinking about institutional ethics. Without such clarity at the institutional level, vague arguments posturing as theological conundrums sprinkled with biblical references have allowed those who wish to abuse the power of their positions to get away with abusing those who have placed their trust in them, precisely because they are in such a position." I agree with Alteres that institutional ethics, in this case, from a Mennonite theoethical peace perspective, are under-theorized. Perhaps it is because many peace theologies and ecclesial ethics fail to consider institutions as moral agents and the implications thereof, especially with regards to power. As I've already discussed, institutions are organisms with habits and histories. Recognizing that and fostering open practices of accountability help to keep institutions healthy. I have also observed through my own experiences at Mennonite-related institutions and through my background in peace theology and ecclesial ethics, that institutions and persons connected to an Anabaptist Mennonite history or identity may fail to theorize the church's ethical nature and our Christian institutions as moral agents, in part because we tend to focus heavily on discipleship ethics. That is how individual disciples interpret the teachings of Jesus for faith and life. That said, it is also the case that Anabaptist Mennonites highly value the church and believe Christian ethics are ecclesial ethics that stem from character formation in the community of faith. At times, an understanding of the communal and the individual or the personal exist for Anabaptist Mennonites, but this can often happen without adequate attention to the ways in which both of those are shaped by intersecting relationships of power. As scholar Gloria Albrecht argued years ago in response to Stanley Hauerwas's ecclesial ethic, we need to talk about the character of our communities, not simply that we are, as the title of Hauerwas's book read, communities of character. In other words, character formation or ecclesial ethics do not happen in a vacuum. Therefore, let's talk about what kind of character we're forming, according to what norms and whose experiences, and within what pre-existing relationships of power. Returning to Alteres' argument, what would clarity at an institutional level look like regarding institutional ethics, and how could we increase accountability? For one thing, as the study out of Duke University found, the clearer an institution's mission statement, the greater the likelihood of it living into it. To that end, a clear mission statement and defined norms are beneficial. Additionally, I see the value of generating a set of commitments that illustrate how the university seeks to live into its values. For example, a commitment to use power and authority responsibly and to manage institutional roles and responsibilities with respect for all concerned. Further to the issue of how to foster greater accountability to those who are most vulnerable, most universities have today an ethics committee whose task it is to evaluate ethical problems in relation with research with human or animal participants, as well as personal data. Research ethics committees are, of course, necessary and important. However, I wonder whether some form of ethics committee could or should be available to engage any ethical issue related to institutional ethics, not simply research ethics. A third-party ethics committee that invites conversations about institutional ethics with a commitment to peace and justice clearly defined could help promote a culture of openness and a habit of regular ethical reflection and accountability. Topics of conversation could include, for example, the harms of short-term contracts with reduced benefits, exploring remnants of colonialism in the academy, the environmental impact of university travel, where the food in the cafeteria is sourced from, etc. Paired with an option for conflict resolution services, it could be another valuable tool for fostering a culture of peace and justice at the institution. Another idea would be institutional ethics taught in a course, and as part of which that it would invite reflection on the host institution itself. It would serve a slightly different purpose, but would still be valuable. In conclusion, the Rempel case is different from the other cases discussed today in many ways. Grebel's response, which included a president publicly advocating for survivors, and the institution naming the harm done and offering resources for survivors, as well as an ongoing commitment to learn what more it can do, appears to be in line with its mission, vision, and values as an institution committed to peace and justice and advocating for the least of these. Institutions operate as moral agents and can and should be held accountable as such. They are contextual. They have a history with the land, Indigenous peoples as formed by racialized, gendered, sexualized, and classed assumptions. Ongoing awareness of these realities and a corresponding mission, vision, and value statement with detailed commitments for what these values mean and how we seek to live them out could help clarify the institution's identity and role as a moral agent and increase accountability. It is also true that no person or institution is perfect, and we do ourselves harm if that is the ideal that we seek or expect. To be life-giving, and that is to be justice-seeking and peace-oriented, ethical reflection must, as scholar Eleanor Haney articulates, move between the poles of analysis of what exists and the construction or vision of what might be. An ideal moral vision, as well as a realistic view of unequal relationships of power within the institution presently, are both necessary. And in that vein, I've named a vision for a possible ethics committee or space for conversations about institutional ethics that fosters healthy habits of reflecting on the institution's ethics and power dynamics. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.